Here we have an interview where Professor Peterson gives a monologue on the Bible, quite heartfelt, but rather biased. Let's watch together.
In fact, culture is a structure of category that we all share. So we see things the same way. Well, that's why we can talk. I mean, not exactly the same way, because then we'd have nothing to talk about. But roughly speaking, we have a bedrock of agreement. That's the Bible, by the way.
Just a quick pause here. Since when is the Bible a bedrock of agreement? If anything, it's a bone of contention even among the different factions of Christianity, let alone atheists and Gnostics and whatever other religions there are in the Western civilization. But let's continue.
So I just walked through the Museum of the Bible in Washington. That was very cool. It's a very cool museum.
So the structure, that's what the Bible
Yeah, it's what
provides.
I figured out. I just figured this out this week. So it was a cool thing to walk through because it's chronological. They have one floor which is the history of the Bible. But it's not exactly that. It's really what it is the history of the book. Now, in many ways, the first book was the Bible. I mean, literally, because at one point there was only one book. Like, as far as our Western culture is concerned, there was one book. And for a while, literally, there was only one book. And that book was the Bible. And then before it was the Bible, it was, it was scrolls and it was writings on papyrus. But we were starting to aggregate written text together. And it went through all sorts of technological transformations. And then it became books that everybody could buy, the book everybody could buy. And the first one of those was the Bible.
Well, first of all, the only reason the Bible was the first book, or to be accurate, the most poignant of the first books, is that during the Dark Ages, reading and writing were restricted mainly to monks, and the church actively discouraged and even banned any other writings. Simple as that.
And then it became all sorts of books that everybody could buy. But all those books, in some sense, emerged out of that underlying book. And that book itself, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library. It's a collection of books. And so what I figured out was, partly because I was talking to my brother-in-law, Jim Keller, who's the world's greatest chip designer and has now designed a chip that's as powerful as the human brain, which is optimized for artificial intelligence learning, by the way. And so I talked to him about that. He said, "You heard of the internet?" I said, "Yeah, Jim, I've heard of the internet." He said, "This is way more revolutionary than that." So in any case, we were talking about meaning in text because we were talking about translation and the problem of understanding text. And Jim said, the meaning of words is coded in the relationship of the words to one another. And the postmodernists make that case, that all meaning is derived from the relationship between words. That's wrong because, well, what about rage? That's not words. And what about moving your hand? That's not words. So it's wrong, but part of it's right because the meaning we derive from the verbal domain is encoded in the relationship between words. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary revelations. And Milton would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, not because of the arbitrary dictates of power, but because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, okay, with the Bible at its base.
Placing the Bible at the bottom of a hierarchy which contains artistic expressions of literary nature, like Shakespeare, Milton, and Dante, which were mentioned here, is profoundly wrong. It is like claiming that, for example, that Michelangelo's sculptures have their origin in the crude silex stone hammers crafted by the Neanderthals. Just because they are all carvings, which they are, of course, one needs to smoke a lot to find similarities between them. The Bible is hardly an artistic work. If anything, it is a tool. Obviously, the most important tool of Christian religion, but a tool nonetheless. It cannot be placed at the origin of literary artistic expression. In fact, the linguistic productions, as a professor calls them, have been around since long before the Bible, manifested in poems, legends, myths, songs. All civilizations have them. Obviously, very few endured because, as already mentioned, reading and writing have started being openly available to the population, at least to the Western civilization, only within the last, let's say, 300 years or so.
Which is certainly the case. Now imagine that's the entire corpus of linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? The answer is you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that.
You don't listen and see through a low-resolution representation of whatever, which, by the way, makes no sense, to me at least. In fact, you listen and see, and by that I mean you perceive the world through a mesh of judgments which originate, first, from your own experiences, and second, from assimilating others' experiences. This mesh represents the sum of all your learning processes and constitutes the foundation of your reactions to the world. And while in some cases of zealotism, this mesh is heavily influenced by the Bible, indeed, this can absolutely not be generalized for the Western civilization.
And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true. It's a whole different kind of true. And I think this is not only literally the case, factually, I think it can't be any other way. It's the only way we can solve the problem of perception.
As for the Bible being, and I quote, way more true than just true, end of quote, I'm just going to say that according to the Genesis, the whole of humanity is descending from the three sons, yes, that is three men, Adam and Eve had. To conclude, it is rather obvious that Professor Peterson is more than just slightly biased in as far as the Bible is concerned, given how he pushes his rhetoric into the land of fairies. To be clear, there is undoubtful value in the Bible as a moral foundation and a certain usefulness as a guidebook on one's journey to God, although that does not really apply to everyone. However, further than that, people should stop forcing the Bible as immutable and absolute truth, because that does more harm than good. An analytical mind will find a hard time accepting the inconsistencies in the Bible, and once the Bible rejected, and we know the Bible is the foundation of belief in God under Christian dogma, then more often than not, the whole concept of God collapses, and atheists are born. And that is the real shame, because God exists above all human writings, good or bad, and in fact above all religion or philosophy, which are all man-made. And each individual's relation to the divinity is unique and very personal. Hence, an exact single path to God, or to salvation, as the Christianity so arrogantly calls it, cannot be laid out. Each religion offers a map, better or worse, but the most important thing for each individual is to start the journey, wholeheartedly, keeping the destination in focus, not the path. And then the baby steps will fall in the right direction, one after another. That's it for now. Have a splendid day.